Elden Ring is nothing short of a masterpiece. It's no secret that Elden Ring is one of the best games of the generation, let alone 2022. Winning hundreds of awards, spawning endless memes and jokes, and cementing Miyazaki as one of the best developers of our time, Elden Ring's impact on gaming and its wider culture cannot be understated. With all that said and done, I have a confession to make. I hated Elden Ring.
The problem with you is, you're completely delusional.
I hated its philosophy to boss design, I couldn't get to grips with its combat and inventory systems, and I found the world and lore boring. I could understand its greatness, appreciate its artistic elements, but for the life of me, couldn't force myself to see it through. And with that, I put the game down around the 30-hour mark, with no intention to go back. Until now. With almost everyone unanimously agreeing that Elden Ring was one for the history books, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to see what everyone else saw in it. I had to experience this game that was meant to be like no other. But I knew what I was getting myself into. The game hasn't changed. It still has all of those problems that I couldn't ignore. So instead, I had to change. And to do that, I had to go back and experience From Software's earlier work to truly grasp what makes Elden Ring special. In this video, I'm going to take you all on a journey with me as I experience Dark Souls 1 to 3, and finally, to Elden Ring. Playing Dark Souls 1 was a weird experience for me. Long had I watched video essays from my favourite YouTubers discussing and analysing all aspects of the game and talking about the profound effect it had on their lives. Often in forms of media, when it's hyped up to such an immense pedestal, its only option is to disappoint. Dark Souls 1 didn't disappoint. In fact, Dark Souls 1 was able to do what I wasn't expecting. It surprised me. I knew all about its interconnected level design. I knew about its dark, depressing setting. I knew about all the amazing boss fights like Sif and Ornstein and Smough. But to truly grasp any of these aspects, I had to experience it for myself. In my first playthrough, I ended up looping all the way through Depths, down to Blighttown, and then back up again through New Londo Ruins, just to return to Firelink Shrine. The bright sky felt like a safe haven compared against the poison-filled hells I had been travelling through, and the sense of returning to a place of sanctuary was fervent. That's a feeling I will never forget, and one that very few games have replicated since. The setting of Lordran is just perfect. From the sunny yet unsettling backdrop of Anor Londo to the majestic nature of Crystal Cave, and my personal favourite, the icy, unloved painted world of Ariamis, everything feels purposefully handcrafted to create this sense of despair. That sense only gets strengthened by the events that take place within the Lost Kingdom to both the player and the NPCs. From talking to the other inhabitants around you, you get to learn their stories. Spoiler alert, they aren't happy ones. Dark Souls showed me that interactions with NPCs aren't just scripted events. I mean, of course they are, but somehow they were able to mask it in a way that made these characters feel alive. They react to your conversations, travel to new places, change their appearance or even their allegiance to you. You can find them later on as if they're a completely different person. It felt like I wasn't special. I was just travelling through the lands just like anyone else, and finding our paths intertwined along the way. There's something to be said for the game locking away fast travel for the first half of your journey. Personally, I love it. Fast travel for me in any game always felt like the developer having to compensate for a really boring world to explore or traverse, giving the player the option to disengage with the world they created. Here in Dark Souls, it feels like a blessing. Initially, having to travel all the way from Quelaag's domain to the top of Sen's fortress and then back down again to get a specific item or NPC interaction felt tiresome. However, before long, I was able to map out the entire world of Lordran in my head. I knew the fastest routes, the safest paths, where the bonfires are and how everything was interconnected. To this day, I feel like I have a picture-perfect memory of the beginning areas firmly implanted into my brain, and I love it. The story of the game is as important as you want to make it. Whether you read all the item descriptions, NPC interactions, and watch all the cutscenes is up to you. But to not engage with these aspects is a disservice to the masterful creation that Miyazaki offers up. Before playing Dark Souls, I was that person. I wasn't really one to care for story, often opting for games which prioritized fun gameplay above all else. With Dark Souls, I made sure to read and learn as much as I could about the world, not because I was forced to, but because it was clearly crafted with passion. Passion was also something that clearly went into the game's combat and inventory systems. Let's start with the latter. As an RPG, the players offered up many different options in terms of their own character, what they wear, what they upgrade, and of course, what weapon they use. Correctly building a character in Dark Souls is like trying to figure out a complex maths question. With so many different numbers, abilities, and personal preferences to keep in mind, finding the right build for you can be a challenge. However, when everything matches up just right, that's when combat is at its most fun. Not because it's easy, but because you earn it. Dark Souls 1 combat is something special, never being recreated again since, even by its successors. Clearing out a space of enemies is a tactical mission, where one wrong move can leave you stun-locked for an eternity. Patience is key, as is a good understanding of positioning and your weapon. This was a challenge to learn. At first, under the misapprehension that every gamer has, which is thinking they're the best player ever, I thought I could just speed through the beginning areas with ease. Oblivious to the fact that I went to catacombs first like an idiot, I discovered that I couldn't keep playing it this way. I had to play Dark Souls the way it wanted to be played, and once I figured that out, everything clicked for me. The saying Dark Souls is fair isn't exactly true, at least not in my opinion. Especially in the case of Dark Souls 1, there are many times when it isn't fair. Oftentimes the game disregards its own rules for one reason or another. One painful example of this is the forced death to Seath. While the lore behind the Immortal Dragon is some of my favourite from the series, forcing the player to die to him first time feels cheap. I love being locked up in the cell and having to escape the archives. I think it's a fantastic idea. However, unlike the Boulder in Asylum, there is no way to tell this is going to happen. There is no way to avoid it. While a singular death isn't such a huge deal, its ramifications for the integrity of FromSoft from the point of view of the player is impactful. If the player can be forced into a death once, why can't they again? This is only one example of many small inconsistencies which Dark Souls 1 can be faulted for. Some elevators reset after death, some don't. The awful camera, which is a problem pretty much all of the time. Just everything about curse. Fuck being cursed. And sadly, the game's inconsistent nature extends to its areas and bosses as well. The variety of locales in DS1 really are a mixed bag. The game starts off strong with some stellar portions. Undead Burg, Sen's Fortress, Darkroot Garden. They are all stellar examples of the Dark Souls formula, providing fair bonfires, challenging but fun enemies, and interesting unique ideas which are part of its identity. Sadly though, this excellence does not continue into the latter half. Post Anor Londo, which is most certainly the pinnacle of the game, the areas drop drastically in quality. Tomb of the Giants is conceptually interesting, but falters in execution. Crystal Cave is really stunning to look at, yet its interesting mechanic, looking at the falling snow, is underutilized. And don't even get me started on Lost Izalith. Sadly, the best area of the game is also one of the only optional ones, Painted World of Ariamis. Essentially a smaller scale Dark Souls area, you constantly find yourself opening new pathways leading to earlier sections, allowing for progress to be made through the world itself. The enemies here too are all fair and enjoyable ones to fight, even mixing in some brand new ones specific to this locale. It even culminates in one of the most unique bosses of the entire series, Priscilla, which requires the player to look at her footprints in the snow to actually hit her. Speaking of bosses, oh boy do they vary in Dark Souls 1. Being my first foray into the series, I didn't exactly know what to expect from the bosses. I knew they were a major reason why the game was so amazing, and I knew they were tough as balls, but I didn't know what they were like. Amazingly though, the game was able to tell me everything I needed to know from the first 10 minutes. Asylum Demon is possibly my favourite tutorial in any game, simultaneously able to teach the player the mechanics of the game and show them how weak they are, all the while giving them a great sense of achievement, is nothing short of fantastic. Overall, I think the bosses in Dark Souls 1 are good, but but pale in comparison to later entries. Some standouts for me are the Bell Gargoyles, Sif, and of course Ornstein and Smo. All these bosses have become permanently ingrained into my brain. Through rigorous trial and error I went through to beat them. They all feel fair, setting the standard for future games in terms of their boss design. It's clear how bosses such as Godskin Duo and Red Wolf of Radagon are evolutions of the DNA established from this game. However, for as influential and unforgettable some of the bosses are, others in Dark Souls 1 annoyed me to no end. Firstly, and I'm sure this is to no one's surprise, I don't enjoy Capra Demon, though I doubt anyone really does. But he's not the only annoying one in my eyes. The awful hitboxes of Gaping Dragon, the frustrating ads along with Nito, and of course, everything about Bed of Chaos. Sadly, on repeat playthroughs of Dark Souls 1, I found myself on a roller coaster of emotions before each boss encounter, either eagerly awaiting a tense fight, or dreading the painful frustration to come. But when it comes to replaying Dark Souls 1, nothing matters more than its atmosphere. I could enjoy myself just walking around its meticulously crafted world for hours, without any combat or challenge, and that's mainly in part to its excellent score. The music in Dark Souls 1 was something I didn't expect to love. Rarely do I find myself ever listening to a game's soundtrack after I've beaten it, but with Dark Souls, it was on repeat. The never-ending sense of dread while exploring the open areas, contrasted against the booming, goosebump-inducing boss fight tracks, will never cease to amaze me. In particular, there's one point in the game which is elevated to even greater heights thanks to its perfect score. Gwyn is how you end a game. Gwyn is how you send players away with your game firmly stamped into their brains. Gwyn is how you make someone who wasn't a fan of the Dark Souls formula, like me, fall head over heels in love. Everything about him, from his attack style to his lore, his arena, his music, it's all perfect. Compared to the rest of the bosses in Dark Souls 1, Gwyn is in a league of his own. Had he been in Dark Souls 2 or even 3, he would still be considered to be one of the best bosses in any of the games. He feels 1,000 times more aggressive than anything previous, and it pays off. The difficulty feels just right, even when you're over-leveled. I absolutely adore fighting Gwyn, and it's thanks purely to him that I can appreciate what a good boss fight is, when everything comes together just right to create something breathtaking. There are only 2 other examples in this series of boss fights which are in the same pedigree as him, but more on that later. Overall, Dark Souls 1 was probably the most impactful game in recent memory. Not only did I gain a new understanding and appreciation of the Soul series, but also how I play games. I'm not as good as I think I am. I can't just run in and be careless, and I'm a better gamer for it. Not only this, but the reason I play games was challenged. Narrative is almost always just as important as gameplay, and often searching it out in every nook and cranny can greaten the experience even more. I learned what makes a good boss fight, and equally, what makes an awful one. I fell in love with its interconnected world design and the lore which gave weight to every pixel. Dark Souls 1 might not be perfect, but god damn do I love it. I don't really know where to start with Dark Souls 2. Widely considered to be the worst of the trilogy, I had a difficult time playing through it. Not due to difficulty or hatred, but more so lacking that surprise which I felt playing Dark Souls 1 for the first time. Sure, it could be a case of knowing what to expect now, but that didn't stop me falling in love with the first game. That isn't to say that the whole game is inferior to its predecessor to me. In fact, I would say that the game has certain aspects which are the best in the entire series. I think one great example would be Majula. Majula is Dark Souls 2's crowning achievement. While it could be seen as just another place of sanctuary like Firelink Shrine, there's some magic about Majula which has never been replicated since. While Firelink feels like seeing a sign for a service station after a long road trip needing to pee, Majula is like returning home from said long road trip, finding your house tidy and warm. The sense of peace and comfort felt at Majula makes it stand out in a series of standout locations, and I think it's mainly due in part to its soothing tune. Here, I think, is where Dark Souls really hits its stride when it comes to its music. Majula, Firekeepers, Aldia's theme, these all show how From Software is able to use music in a range of different ways and moods to such a poignant effect. Of course, the usual suite of hype boss music is here, but to me, the standout tracks are the ones which are slower, sadder. They are able to match the depressing story told in Dark Souls 2 flawlessly. Speaking of Dark Souls 2's story, it might be my favourite in the entire series. Compared to both its predecessor and successor, the story here is definitely put more at the forefront. Learning about the kingdom of Drangleic, its inhabitants, the royal family, and your place in the world is made much easier than in Dark Souls 1. I feel as though part of its charm is lost that way. Having to find the story yourself truly felt rewarding and supplemented the rest of the game, but making it more accessible to new players is understandable, especially considering the game's long playtime. I sank around 40 hours in my first playthrough of Dark Souls 2, ensuring I beat all main game bosses and learned as much about the lore as I possibly could. Comparing this to Dark Souls 1, I clocked in around 20 hours in total. This increase in playtime is definitely felt while playing, and sadly I don't mean that in a good way. Much like movies, I feel as though if you're wondering how much left there is to go, it's a bad sign. Around the halfway mark of Dark Souls 2, I was ready for it to end, but it just kept on going. This isn't to say that the second half of the game is bad by any means. I think, especially compared to Dark Souls 1, the experience is way more consistent in terms of quality, but that overall quality is definitely lower. With a total of 32 bosses, it's the highest in the series, and that has a profound effect on gameplay. During my playtime, it felt as though I was taking part in a boss rush, with small open areas between them. This detracted from what I loved most about Dark Souls 1, the exploration. Dark Souls 2 has, in my opinion, the worst areas in the series. I really don't mind Blighttown, or even Farron's Keep, but you would have to pay me to go back through Shrine of Amana again, regardless of how amazing its track is. Tedious, frustrating, lazy. These are all words I can use to describe this area, and sadly others in the game too. Black Gulch, the Gutter, the Undead Purgatory are all a slog to get through. The beginning handful of areas are fantastic. I love the very Dark Souls 1-esque Forest of the Fallen Giants, the beautiful landscape of Hyde's Tower of Flame, and my personal favourite, the Lost Bastille. These are all amazing areas, because they continue the formula set up by its precursor. Sadly, this could also be said for its bosses. Looking back over the list of all the bosses, very few actually live in my head rent-free. Most notably, the Lost Sinner. This feels like an amalgamation of everything that made the bosses in the previous game so fun. Flashy moves, easy telegraphed attacks, and fantastic spectacle. This borrowing of Dark Souls boss DNA isn't only applicable to him though. Velstadt, Looking Glass Knight, and the Pursuer are all great examples and are by far the best bosses of the main game. But sadly, these are the exception rather than the rule. I'm not sure who thought the Royal Rat Vanguard was a good idea. Belfry Gargoyles are a severe step down from their ancestors, and Nashandra is a joke compared to Gwyn. Thankfully though, thanks to the game's peculiar leveling system, these bosses, while tedious and boring, were easy to deal with. Leveling up is way too affordable, to the point where without any grinding, I was clearly overleveled way before the halfway point. This sucked. There isn't really much to do once you're overleveled, as it just seems to spiral out of control. Bosses took a single attempt, new areas felt like I was somehow back at the start. Once the difficulty, which is the foundation for FromSoft's design, is lost, the game loses all sense of weight. Bosses become checkpoint markers, areas become filler. I may have enjoyed Dark Souls 2 a lot more had I not been overleveled, but of course, that's something you can't exactly plan for. Dark Souls 2 tried a lot of new things. Some worked, others didn't. For example, the game forces the player to travel back in time to learn about the events that happened decades ago. This is really cool. You get to explore the same areas again, only this time you can see the events that caused their destruction. You even get to fight the same boss again, but in their prime. It really works, both to advance the lore and create an amazing spectacle. On the other hand though, why do you have to return to Majula every time you want to level up? Don't get me wrong, I love Majula, but having to fast travel back every 10 minutes or so, it's monotonous to say the least. The sense of exploration felt in DS1 is lost, as fast travel becomes a necessity to actually get anywhere in the game. Furthermore, enemies seem to be placed haphazardly, whereas in DS1 every single enemy felt purposeful. The example which comes straight to mind here is the start of Iron Keep. God, this part just sucks. In retrospect, it's obvious that Dark Souls 2 isn't a bad game. It would probably be hailed in the same light that Dark Souls 1 is had it released first. But when succeeding excellence, the flaws are made all the more clear. I have to commend B-Team's attempt. Some parts of the game rival and even exceed its older brother. Modula in particular will always have a place in my heart, and I learned many valuable lessons about what I don't like in the Souls series. Making the game easy just trivializes the experience, to the point where it loses its fun factor. It's not just the hype moments, but the calmer, more serene ones, which make up the entire experience. And rats suck. In every game, they just suck.
Wait a minute, accidents can happen.
Dark Souls 2 is nowhere near the level of excellence of its precursor, but I still appreciate it regardless. I also don't know where to start talking about Dark Souls 3, but unlike DS2, it's for a different reason. Do I start with its ingenious level design, which refined its Souls formula? Do I talk about its deep, rich, yet painful lore, which gives more weight to every action the player takes than ever before? Or do I talk about its perfect, masterful boss fights, which transcend even the series precedent? Why don't we start at the beginning? The game's opening section is able to clearly demonstrate the experience that the player is about to go on. From the first boss, Ludwig Skundir, to discovering Firelink Shrine again, I knew exactly what this game was going to be. A masterclass in boss design, and a clear homage to the first game in the series. The areas in the game clearly derive from the Dark Souls 1 formula, with each area having a great sense of interconnectivity and progression. Standouts for me are the High Wall of Lothric, Archdragon Peak, and of course, revisiting Anor Londo, which was such a treat. It truly felt as though FromSoft took notes from their prior entries into the series, taking what was best and refining it to a beautiful shine. To me, no areas in this game gave me any sense of frustration or boredom. Even Farron Keep, which many Souls veterans hate, I was able to find enjoyment in. Dark Souls 3 was able to fully cement to me what makes a good Souls level: interconnectivity, interesting ideas, and varied vistas. For me personally, I played DS3 completely differently to its earlier counterparts. Whereas before I mainly used fast swords, scaling high into decks, I wanted a different experience this time around. With a general consensus of the right way to play Dark Souls being Ultra Greatsword, I decided to give it a go. While I strongly disagree with there being a correct way to enjoy any game, as anyone and everyone should be allowed to have fun in their own way, this playstyle worked so well for me. I loved the slow, methodical approach to the Ultra Greatsword, biding my time between flurries of attacks just to get a single hit in. This was by far more challenging than any of my previous builds, but for me, that wasn't enough. In order to get the supposed true Dark Souls experience, I only scaled into strength. No vigor, no endurance, just max hard cap strength, naked and with a large sword, and it was thrilling. Difficulty as a whole in Dark Souls 3 is one of its greatest aspects. Sure, I made the game endlessly more difficult for myself, but after the overleveled slogfest of DS2, I wanted to try something different. Here, not a single boss took less than 10 attempts, and I was constantly on the edge of my seat. One mistake would cause my death, and I absolutely loved it. Speaking of things I loved in DS3, the music. Oh god, the music. In my opinion, this game has the best boss music of the entire series. Perfectly matched flawlessly to each boss, the tracks add 110% to the intensity every time. Pontiff's theme, Vort's theme, and my personal favourite, Nameless King's theme. Very few other themes in the series feel this well matched, and considering how often I die to these bosses, it's a very good thing they are as good as they are. When it comes to the new things that Dark Souls 3 does, it's drastically less than the numerous attempts seen in DS2. But that doesn't matter. What DS3 does do, however, is refine each and every aspect of the game, evolving formulas and mechanics seen previously. For example, the weapon art system makes every weapon feel wholly unique. For most of my playthrough, I used the profaned greatsword, transposed from Pontiff's Soul. No weapon in the series feels like this one, and I'm sure in subsequent playthroughs, this game is going to feel completely different again with a different weapon. Once I finished fighting Gwyn, I thought to myself, okay, it doesn't get much better than this. Oh boy was I wrong. Dark Souls 3 serves up banger after banger, with such consistency it's staggering. Apart from a select few mediocre bosses, it's clear that FromSoft learnt from DS2's shortcomings, valuing quality over quantity, and it definitely pays off. Gundyr, Vort, Abyss Watchers, and that's just the opening sections. From around the halfway point, the best bosses of the entire series come at you one after another, and it's truly magical. Pontiff, Dancer, Dragon Slayer Armor, and Lothric could easily be named the best boss fight in any other game, but this is Dark Souls 3. The final two bosses make Gwyn look like the Royal Rat Vanguard. Nameless King is my favourite boss fight I've ever fought in any game. The difficulty feels perfectly tuned, the spectacle is unmatched, and the lore is so poignant it's a crime to not learn about it. Nameless King is the definition of fair and is the perfect paradigm of what makes Dark Souls 3 so great. And then comes Soul of Cinder, and wow, just wow. After Nameless King, I was ready for the game to end. I was happy, content, ready to start Elden Ring with a new mindset. Soul of Cinder changed everything. The idea of perfection is challenging to attribute to any form of media. Of course, it's subjective, and that word is often used hyperbolically to add effect. And yet, when it comes to Soul of Cinder, I genuinely believe it is a perfect boss fight. The setting is stunning, reminiscent of the Kiln of the First Flame, but unique in its own way. The boss's moveset in the first phase is incredibly fair and enjoyable to fight against. The lore surrounding the fight adds so much more to it that it's practically a whole different experience having known it. And then, the music hits. Hearing Gwyn's theme felt so cathartic to me. This journey that I was going on, to try to make myself love a supposed masterpiece, culminated in this perfect boss fight. Fighting the second phase of Soul of Cinder was able to exceed what I thought perfection was, and when I finally beat him, I knew I was ready to play Elden Ring. My experience with Dark Souls 3 was thrilling. The bosses, the areas, everything. It's hard to find flaws in this game, as it's so clear that every single inch was scrutinized over to an exquisite quality. While my heart may still lie with Dark Souls 1 being my favorite of the series, I think objectively Dark Souls 3 is the better game. I learned what makes a great boss fight, discovered the pinnacle of boss music, and found my favorite build to use. So now I think it's finally time to give Elden Ring another go. I remember watching the first ever announcement trailer for Elden Ring all the way back in 2019. Crowds were going wild, the music was hype, everything looked so amazing, and all I could think was, meh. After beating Dark Souls 3, I watched that same trailer back, and it sent goosebumps around my body.
By a video scientifically created to get stuck in your heads forever!
Look up at the sky. It burns.
The Lands Between is a very special place. Initially, I lacked any sense of interest. I didn't care for the lore, so what did I hope to gain by engaging with the world? But now, it was different. The lore of Dark Souls is phenomenal to say the least, and so I knew that if I put in the effort, Elden Ring would not disappoint. And boy, did it not. Every item description, every enemy, every nook and every cranny built up a narrative that is wholly unique in the gaming landscape. Every Uncharted has its Tomb Raider, every Mario its Sonic, but nothing is quite like Elden Ring's story. Just to give you an example, my favourite character from this game is the blacksmith, Hugh. In any other game, this character would just serve its purpose to the player, upgrading gear. And on my first playthrough, that's all I thought he was. But by engaging in the world and the other characters, you start to put together a bigger picture of this person. After interacting with Roderica in a completely different part of the map, you can access a series of interactions between the two. Eventually, Hugh can teach Roderica to level up spirits for the player, a very useful tool in the later portions of the game. Their story continues, but it's touching enough that I don't want to spoil it for you if you haven't already experienced it. Had I not engaged with this seemingly one-dimensional character, my experience with the game would have been completely different, and it's all thanks to my experience playing Dark Souls 1. The atmosphere of Elden Ring is certainly less depressing than the Souls series. Things are still bleak, people are still unhappy, but it's clear that there's a sense of hope. The massive Erd tree is a clear sign of that, a physical light beacon in the middle of the map, guiding the player forward. Well, that is until you burn it. Never before has FromSoft given so much power in the hands of the player. Of course, we have affected the world around us before. We have sent Anor Londo into darkness, murdered kings and queens, but nothing as visually impacting as this. This is reflected obviously in the music itself, once again flawlessly. The unsettling theme of Caelid, the illustrious song for the royal capital of Lindell, and most importantly, the reassuring track for the Round Table Hold, are all excellent examples of FromSoft borrowing from what worked well in Dark Souls 2. They use music here to such great effect, not just in boss fights, but in the calmer moments to really create that contrast. Speaking of boss fights, they really nailed them. Comparing Dark Souls 2 and 3 bosses are a comparison of quality or quantity. Elden Ring does away with this indecision and instead does both gracefully. In my first playthrough, I really hated most of what I fought. I felt as though I was always underleveled, couldn't get a hit in, and bosses killed me way too fast. What I'm trying to say here is that I was bad. Real bad.
What do I look like? A fool?
Refighting Margit this time was such a thrill. Perfectly balanced and fair, and still feeling unique against the suite of bosses I'd fought in the Souls games. One complaint I've heard lots against Elden Ring's bosses is that they aren't like Dark Souls bosses. They react to your actions, they can trick the player by delaying their attacks, and so on and so forth. After beating a total of 64 bosses in the Souls games, it was refreshing to fight such a reactive and ingenious boss. And of course, the game doesn't stop there. Horror Lou, Godskin Duo, Dragon Lord Flaccid Nutsacks are all just brilliant bosses. And yet, they're nothing compared to the best of the game, Malenia. I've been playing video games pretty much all my life, and in that time I've beaten a lot of excellent boss fights. Jetstream Sam, Mario Galaxy's Bowser fight, David in Killer is Dead, but no boss is as amazing or took me as long as Malenia. Hours of my life flew by, seasons changed outside my window. I just had to beat her, no matter what, because she felt like the perfect natural evolution of DS3's boss formula. A fair, two-phase spectacle-filled fight. Every single one of her attacks was fair, yes, even waterfowl, and I knew I could beat her from my first attempt. And when I finally did beat her, it was the best feeling of the entire Souls journey I had been on, and I did it summonless. Summons are a very difficult topic to discuss in relation to Elden Ring. Such a fleshed out mechanic in the game, it's hard to argue their place in the question of what is the right way to play Elden Ring. Like I said previously, while I strongly disagree with there being a correct way to enjoy any game, as anyone and everyone should be allowed to have fun in their own way, but personally, playing with summons is a waste of what FromSoft have created. I used an Ultra Great Sword build again, just like I did in Dark Souls 3, but I also used the Mimic tier, and it was the worst mistake of my entire playthrough. The Mimic tier trivialized fights for me. Certain bosses like Malekith, I was able to beat first try, and it wasn't even close. That's when I decided I was going to beat Malenia summonless. Try to regain that difficulty which I had carelessly given away because in my mind, that's the right way for me to play Elden Ring. Where FromSoft couldn't expound on their earlier works is the large open spaces. This being their first open world game, they had to completely work from scratch and develop a style that worked for them. And while I wasn't as enamored as other Souls YouTubers, it's definitely a massive success on their part. In my first playthrough, I scoured every inch of Limgrave, mainly in an attempt to try to overlevel to compensate for being awful. I still remember my first time entering Siofra River. While that playthrough was a miasma of anger and disappointment, that one moment was beautiful. From Software knows how to make stunning locations, and the variety on offer in Elden Ring is staggering. This is one of the many reasons exploring Elden Ring is thrilling, along with, of course, the loot. One major gripe I had with the game first time through was a lack of reasonable rewards, by which I mean I would be rewarded for activities with things that I had no use for. Memory stones, weapons with stats I wasn't going to spec into, and different spells and incantations which I obviously wasn't going to use. Of course, coming back to the game, nothing had changed. I was still getting rewarded with the same things that I wasn't going to use, but that didn't mean I wasn't gaining anything. Reading item descriptions, learning more about this fascinating world, and broadening my opportunities for later builds. The feeling of lacking any sense of reward spoke more to my lack of enjoyment rather than an actual issue with the game itself. Elden Ring, while making many large-scale changes, also changed small aspects compared to the Soul series, which went a long way to making my experience with it so amazing. Mainly the runbacks. While a staple since the first Souls installment, running back to bosses for 5 minutes after every death always stung. I understand their inclusion, an extra level of difficulty as well as a chance for the player to have time to learn and react to their last attempt. But to me, it always felt hand-holdy in a way that is uncharacteristic for the Souls games. If I need to learn from my past attempt, I don't want to feel forced into menially running through the same lot of enemies just to reach the fog wall again. With Elden Ring, this wasn't a problem. At no point during my time with the game did I think the run back was too long or tedious. I felt like the game was urging me to keep trying over and over again until I got it right, and I loved it. When I finished Elden Ring, I instantly started my second run, and then my third. Very few games have ever elicited this kind of response from me before. I was hooked on this world, its characters, its systems, its combat, everything. While I could understand its greatness before, now I felt its greatness. There's a quote that perfectly sums up the way I feel about Elden Ring. It's from Jacob Geller in his video about his favourite games of the past year. In it, he spoke,
"When I was a kid, I'd daydream about what I wanted games to be in the future. What if in Zelda you could also do this? What if this game never stopped making bosses? What if what I thought was the end had barely scratched the surface?" And Elden Ring is effectively that game I was daydreaming about.
And I couldn't agree more. I remember playing Mario Galaxy as a child. With its small, distinct open sections, I used to always wonder how far the medium of games could go. What would the game makers of the future be able to create for us to enjoy? What lengths would they go to as they strive for perfection? No game has ever felt so polished, so cared for as Elden Ring, and I doubt no game will for some time to come. There are games that we hate for whatever reasons. Some games just aren't our style, they just don't click with us. Like any form of media, that's a completely rational response. But sometimes, you just aren't ready for it. I'm sure there's a game that you've hated for years, wouldn't ever dare to try again, but with a little work on your end, you might finally be able to love it for how it deserves to be loved. I hated Elden Ring. I couldn't ever see myself loving it the way basically the whole world did. But through learning, discovering my likes and dislikes, pushing myself into new genres that I wouldn't have ever thought of playing, I was able to change my mind. Elden Ring is a masterpiece. And it's a game for me.